Hello everyone and welcome to a really great and exciting event. This is the launch event for National Science Week in SA. So I'm Dr. Debbie and we are going to be talking about a pretty exciting Australian animal. If you want to know anything more about Science Week, which is more of a science month really because you can't fit that much great science into just a week, jump over to inspiringsa.org.au to see the events for the rest of the time. I also do want to acknowledge, before I introduce our lovely guest, that our entire show is currently being, it's on Kaurna land, who the Kaurna people are the traditional custodians of this land and have an extremely deep connection and knowledge of the nature surrounding them in this area. So keep that in mind as we go into our talk. So, I am joined today by Professor Chris Daniels from the International Koala Centre of Excellence to tell me all about koalas, unsurprisingly, I hope. So,
good evening, Deb. It's great to be here.
You're ready to talk some koalas, get some fuzziness in the air?
Absolutely, about one of the most amazing animals on the planet. One of the top 3 most loved animals, in fact, across the world.
Oh, well, I'm going to talk to you after about what the other 2 are because I could definitely go for another hour. But if they're in the top 3, what makes them so unique against other Australian animals like kangaroos, for example?
Oh, look, there's so many things about koalas that are incredibly unusual, specialised and different. And we'll go through those first in a minute. But first, I want to make one thing really, really clear. Koalas are not bears. It's absolutely vital that we get to understand the difference between a bear and a koala. So both bears and koalas are mammals. Koalas belong to a group of mammals known as marsupials. So they give birth to a tiny little baby that is about the size of a baked bean in many species, that makes its way to a pouch and connects to a teat there and grows up in the pouch. Bears belong to another group of mammals, the same group that we belong to, a group called the eutherian mammals, and these give birth to often more well-developed babies and they don't carry them around the pouch. The term bear is therefore really unusual, and it probably goes back to the times when Europeans first came here and they saw all these weird and wonderful animals and they had no idea what they were. But they looked a little superficially like some animals that were found in Europe. So we called a lot of our animals after animals that they knew. So we had marsupial cats, marsupial mice, the Tasmanian tiger. And koalas probably got called bears for the same reason. And then it stuck. But koalas are not bears, they are marsupials.
Well, if they're a marsupial then and not a bear, what animals are they related to?
So they actually have a really interesting relationship. They evolved originally from a group known as the diprotodonts, which means 2 front teeth, 2 incisors there. So marsupials evolved about 90 million years ago, probably in North America, and they spread around the world. And here you can see a map of a tree that shows the relationship between various forms of marsupials. So they evolved somewhere in North America, they then travelled to South America, and then about 50 million years ago, a group moved into Australia and became the black line down the bottom.
Is that considered a long time ago when you're looking at evolutionary history?
Oh, it's a pretty long time ago, yes, but it was a time of transition from the age of the dinosaurs, and where mammals were sort of small little things running around, into the big explosion. So it's a long time ago, but it was a time of great and rapid change. And so these things came to Australia about 50 million years ago and then underwent these rapid changes. So we wound up with a whole lot of separate groups like the carnivorous groups, we had bandicoots, and then we had this one group, the diprotodonts. And about 40 million years ago, they radiated. In other words, lots of species and groups came out. One of which was the vombatiformes, which is a Latin word of saying wombat, really. And about 40 million years ago, they appeared, and then from them came the koala about 25 million years ago. And that's the group right at the bottom of the line there on that black phylogenetic tree.
So koalas are quite closely related to wombats?
Yes, yes. In fact, koalas actually come from this group of diprotodonts that had this spectacular radiation across Australia. In fact, at one stage it was the most diverse before another group related to the koalas and wombats, the kangaroos, came to become the most speciose, so the most largest number of species. So there you can see another phylogenetic tree which shows the relationship between koalas that appeared about 25 million years ago, and the only other living member of this group, which is the wombats, right over in the top right-hand corner, my right-hand corner here. But lots of other things appeared at the same time. Enormous, great things that look like marsupial rhinos. There were carnivorous ones that we call Thylacoleo, and a whole lot of other really unusual things. There were about 6 genera of koalas in the Great Radiation and 18 different species. So koalas were all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And probably the ancestor of all of these animals was an animal that looked a bit like a koala but had a big long tail and was a bit possum-like. Was certainly a tree dweller.
So this phylogenetic tree is essentially a genetic family tree, but with things like wombats being the more closely related ones. So were there any other types of koalas?
Yes, yeah. So there are all of these different groups, these 18 groups. Some of them were on the ground. Some of them were really big. So it's really, imagine a really large koala that was about the size of a St. Bernard wandering around the place. Really spectacular. And yeah, phylogenetic tree shows the relationship between different sorts of animals. So you can see they are quite distantly related when you compare to all the other groups, but they've all gone extinct.
Right.
So the only ones left now is 1 species of koala and 3 species of wombat.
So you spoke a little bit about how some of the koalas went extinct. Why would that have happened? Yeah,
it's a great question, and look, we don't know. There's probably a wide range of factors. There could be that this group evolved first as plant eaters. It was almost certainly a plant-eating ancestor, and then it wound up competing with other plant eaters that came along, the kangaroos, the potoroos, the possums. There may be some of that, a change in the nature of the landscape, impact of other animals, and of course the impact of people, because first Australians arrived here about 60,000 years ago and brought them with them fire and hunting, and they're likely to have impacted on quite a number of these species as well.
So a lot of that is environmental. But Australia is really diverse in its environment. So do koalas today live all over Australia, or are they isolated to certain spaces?
They're isolated to a certain type of environment. So koalas live in trees. The term we use is arboreal. And they're highly specialised on the diet of eucalypt. So we have about 600 species of eucalypt trees across Australia, but in fact koalas eat only about 20 20 species of them.
That's a very picky eater.
They are incredibly picky eaters, Deb. They will change their preference. They're like a little kid. You know, one time they'll only eat this tree, and then the next day they won't. Or they'll only eat the tips of the leaves and not the other ones. So they can be unbelievably fussy eaters. And in different parts of their range, they'll eat different sorts of trees. But the koala that we have now around today had a range that extended from basically the far north of Queensland along the east coast through the more denser forests and open woodlands of New South Wales and down into Victoria. They did extend into the southeast. They were eliminated from there by excessive hunting and harvesting about 2009, but then were reintroduced to Kangaroo Island and the Mount Lofty Ranges, Eyre Peninsula and the River Murray since the 1920s.
And do those koalas behave the same, the ones that were reintroduced, or even over that different climate that looks like it's quite a lot of environments? It's going from tropical to quite Mediterranean almost. Do those koalas
They exhibit similar behaviours, although they're very closely related. So it's actually 1 species of koala found from the top of northern Queensland right down into Victoria, but they look different. So they have different, what we call different morphotypes or different structures. So the 2 groups that are sometimes called subspecies in Queensland and New South Wales are smaller, they're grey, they're substantially slighter, and you can see in the picture here, they're the one on my right, the tiny little guy there. The ones that are found in Victoria and that were introduced into South Australia is the big buffy one with the fantastic ears, much, much larger animal, browner in colour. And this difference, it's been suggested, is an adaptation to a colder climate, so they can put up with the harsher weather of Victoria.
Right.
But genetically, they're very, very similar. So you can think of them like us. You know, if you have a big Tahitian rugby player, or you have a very small Vietnamese woman, very different in shape and size, but in fact the same species. Koalas are in that same category.
So which one of these two koalas is the drop bear then?
Right, great question. The answer is neither of them, sadly. The drop bear is one of my favourite stories, of course, about koalas, and it's part of the great Australian legend, the great Australian sense of humour, that out there in the wild is a koala with sharp, pointy teeth, capable of leaping upon you and killing you instantly, particularly if you're an overseas visitor. Apparently they can tell those apart. The only way to protect yourself is to put Vegemite behind your ears, and that puts them off. And of course, this is a great story, and people love to believe it. Interestingly, though, there was a carnivorous koala. Way back, when we look back at that phylogenetic tree, we talked about there being a big woolly kind of wombat-y type animal called the diprotodon, and there were other things that are sometimes called marsupial tapirs, but there was one called a marsupial lion. And this is, of course, not a lion. Its scientific name is Thylacoleo carnifex. It is a marsupial, closely related to the koala, but evolved a carnivorous diet. And so it's got the same two big pointy incisors. It's got sharp shearing molars, and it apparently lived in trees and did jump onto prey as they walked past, probably the giant diprotodons or giant wombats or something like that. And this animal died out about 30,000 years ago, give or take 5,000 years. And it is thought that it overlapped with Aboriginal people, who, as I said, arrived here about 50 to 60,000 years ago. So chances are the Aboriginal people had contact with this animal.
Wow.
And it was something that would have leapt upon them much like a leopard. So they actually did come in contact with a large carnivorous koala relative that could have attacked them.
That sounds terrifying, and I thought today's Australian animals were supposed to be scary enough.
Yeah, well, this one would have been seriously scary because it is quite big. It was the size of a jaguar, and it's got really, really spectacular teeth. It also had a really big claw on its thumb for grappling.
Wow.
So yes, there was a time when people in Australia were attacked by giant killer koalas.
Wow. So the Thylacoleo, as well as some of the other koalas, they went extinct because of a whole bunch of different issues. What about today's koalas? What kind of challenges might they face?
So they've had a really tough time over the last 200 years since European colonisation. And said they extended over a huge range, and they were surprisingly common. In fact, probably the only thing that controlled their numbers was bushfire. We came and we saw they had these wonderful pelts, so they were hunted, and they were incredibly heavily hunted through the 19th and early part of the 20th century. By the time hunting stopped in the 1920s, up to 1 million koalas a year were shot, and their pelts were sent to the United States particularly and turned into clothing. They're often sold as possum skin because the fur is so thick and so warm, it was really prized. So hunting was a big issue, and that retracted them to often small islands. Since then, the big one continues to be habitat loss. So clearing of all of their forest land for agriculture and for cities, towns, for our use has been a huge impact on them, particularly in New South Wales and in Queensland. And so we see this situation where koalas just don't have trees, they've lost their habitat, all their specialisations are gone, and they really struggle.
So we've seen a few of those koala signs. I remember getting really excited when I moved to Australia, seeing the signs saying there was a koala crossing or there were koalas coming up. But how do roads impact koalas?
So roads have got a lot to answer for in terms of keeping koalas safe, because koalas will come down, usually at night, and will wander around. They need to move from one tree to the next. So koalas eat a lot of leaves because the leaves don't have very much nutrition. So koala will eat about 50 trees a year, the equivalent, the amount of leaves on about 50 trees a year. So they come down and they wander around. When they come onto the roads, they're obviously incredibly vulnerable. They can be hit by cars, they can wind up being trapped on one side of the road and can't get across, so they become isolated. And the big freeways across their entire range take out a lot of koalas each year. It's a huge issue.
If the koalas can eat up to like 50 trees a year, but they're only eating a few species, if all of the koalas are together, how is there enough food?
And that can be another big issue they have. So in much of their range, the koalas are declining. They're declining dramatically in Queensland and in New South Wales through habitat clearance and disease and other things that we'll talk about. But in Victoria and in South Australia, and they were introduced into South Australia in the 1920s to save them. They were introduced onto the Kangaroo Island, and then from there a population into the Mount Lofty Ranges, and they grew in number enormously. They became what we call overabundant, which means there were more koalas there that their trees could support. And in this picture here, you can see the effect of too many koalas overeating, or over-browsing is the term, and then the trees die and the koalas really struggle. So in some parts of their range, we have an issues around overabundance, and in other parts of the range, we have an issues of dramatic decline in numbers.
Wow, so it's like two completely different issues. They must need to be managed quite differently.
That's right. That's the real challenge, is understanding that here, even though you have groups that look different, it's basically the same animal, but has very different challenges across its range. And so you need a management strategy that will look at all of these different aspects. And what can we learn about koalas when there are too many? And what does that tell us in order to recover koalas in areas where there are too few?
So speaking of overabundance and the behaviours that cause overabundance, I have always been told that koalas are chlamydia-ridden. What about disease?
So disease is another huge factor that tackles, that is a population limiter for koalas. So here you have a picture of chlamydia in a northern koala, one from New South Wales or Queensland. Chlamydia is a bacteria, it's an intracellular bacteria, and it affects the mucous membrane, so it affects eyes, it affects the reproductive tract, and so forth. And that can send koalas blind, it can lead them to become infertile, they can fall from trees and die, and it's a terrible, terrible condition. And in fact, koalas over almost all of their range have a large proportion of the population has chlamydia. In some parts, it's up to 100%. They are also subject to another nasty disease called CORV, which is koala retrovirus. And this is often called koala AIDS. It behaves like AIDS. It's an immunosuppressive virus, and it can lead to tumours of the lymphatic system, which means its ability to deal with infections. And then those two diseases, chlamydia and CORV, combine, and that can be a real disaster. And koalas are also subject to influenza, to mange, so to a range of other things, gut problems, and these all are real challenges for keeping koalas alive.
Is that anything more than what other animals experience in terms of disease?
Yeah, look, most species now, because they wind up isolated in little pockets because of the way we've occupied land, and don't have that capacity to move around a bit, and sometimes become overabundant, will suffer similar sorts of diseases. So CORV and chlamydia, for example, are sexually transmitted. So when the animals are in close contact, these diseases move easily between one and another, and that creates a real problem. Similarly with influenza. So these sorts of diseases are a problem in overabundant animals, or in animals that come together or are in one small spot. And a lot of species have similar types of issues.
What about our relationship with koalas? What's the impact of people?
Well, people obviously have a huge impact with koalas because so much of their range now is where we live. And so in a place like South Australia, we have lots of koalas in our backyards, in the southern suburbs and the eastern suburbs, the townships of the Mount Lofties, Kangaroo Island, lots of koalas, and we come in contact with them every day. And this can be a real challenge for koalas. They can come down and drink from your swimming pool, as in the picture here, and sometimes animals do that because they have a genetic issue, a genetic disease called oxalate nephrosis. And that's particularly common in South Australian koalas, and may well have a genetic base because koalas were introduced onto Kangaroo Island from one small population on French Island, where they came originally. They got there from the Otways, and then from Kangaroo Island they came into the Mount Lofties. And each time it was only a small found a population. And this population seems to be carrying this gene for oxalate nephrosis, which causes crystals of oxalate to form in the blood. And these are little bow-shaped crystals. They look like bow ties, much like your bow tie there.
Don't know if that's what I want to be associated with.
But if you look at your bow tie, the edges there, they can be quite sharp, and those edges slice the parts of the kidney that filter the blood.
Wow.
And these things are called nephrons, and smash them all up. And so the koalas produce large amounts of dilute urine, basically lots of water. They dehydrate. And so they come down to the pool to drink, and they can be trapped in there. In fact, they can come into our house. And there's a lovely picture there sent to us by a resident of the hills who woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning because there was a loud noise downstairs, went in and found a koala in the toilet. And that koala had come in, probably smelling the water, and was really thirsty. And of course, people interact with koalas on the roads. They give them drinking. And our dogs. And dogs are a huge impact on koalas, particularly northern koalas that are smaller. So we have all of these connections with koalas that can be really hard on them.
But at the same time, we have this very strong association with them where we actually really want to help them.
Yeah, that's one of the issues about koalas, which puts them in their top 3 most amazing animals, is that they bring out a very strong reaction in us. We very, very powerfully connect with the koalas. The koala has this forward-facing face. It has big eyes, these incredibly cute ears. You can hold it and cuddle it. The fur is soft and it's a beautiful, warm animal. And so people get really attached to it. In fact, it's on many people's bucket list as something that they want to do, is to hold or pat a koala. And people come from all around the world to do just that. So they have been a very strong connector between people and nature. And we really saw that recently with the bushfires.
Yeah, absolutely. And because they have such a strong connection with us, I remember one time when I was at a conference and I was with my friend and they said, "What science do you do?" I said, "I study plants." And my friend said, "I study koalas." So everyone jumped over and was like, "Oh, tell me about them." When it comes to the science of koalas, what can we do there? What are we researching?
So there's so many of these issues with koalas that we've just touched on. And people want to solve the problems associated with koalas. They want to deal with the issues. Nobody wants to see koalas disappear from Australia, and nobody around the world wants to see that. And they're very important economically. They're important for our tourism. They're important for manufacture. People make little fluffy koalas. They're all sorts of big issues. And of course, they have become a really important poster child for climate change and for habitat loss and so forth. So there is a need to do a lot of research, and that research really has to focus on koala diseases, how people connect with koalas, and habitat use. And we need to think a little bit then about how you use that research for conservation purposes. So conservation science has tended to focus on finding remnant areas of bushland, of habitat, and preserving that for koalas. And that's absolutely the number one approach for conserving any particular species, is to retain high quality remnant habitat. And there's a lot more we can do with that.
Yeah.
That's the stage one, really important stage. And we do more. We need to engage in people or with people to do much more, to rehabilitate damaged land and to replant and resurrect areas that have been destroyed. We need to think about breeding animals for release, a process called rewilding that's become really popular. We need to get people engaged with animals in their backyards. Most of the land that holds many of our important species is our land, our backyards. So how can we make our backyards not just koala safe, but koala friendly? And to be able to connect little patches of remnant vegetation together through our backyards. There's a lot of areas that we can do there. We can think about translocating species, and that's been popular elsewhere in the world, where you move species or individuals from one spot to another, effectively what we did on Kangaroo Island. Or even moving them very great distances, even other countries. So at Monarto Zoos SA, for example, are taking 35 rhino from Africa because of the understanding that they're in real risk of disappearing from there. And then from there you can reintroduce them later. We've done that with Pierre David's deer and with Przewalski's horse and a lot of other species. So there's all of those things that we can do. And then, of course, through the scientific process, we can engage people. And koalas are a wonderful animal to engage people. So through citizen science projects, you can count them, find them, identify them. We can work with people to understand what they think are issues, how you deal with different issues in different locations. And it's a tremendous way for people to connect with nature and to understand the process of science. Because by doing science, you get an idea of how hard it is and how important it is for understanding these animals.
So that sounds like very field-based for a lot of that. And as an unashamed geneticist, how do we come up with programs for breeding, or how do we even know anything? How do we know that the northern and the southern koala are genetically the same?
So there's quite a lot in that question. That's got a big question there. We think about this not as field-based because it's actually many different types of science. So it includes social science, much of the medical and pathological science, and of course the genetics. So selecting the right animals for breeding, for reintroduction, for understanding genetic diseases like oxalate nephrosis, for really being able to deal with the infective diseases, so the role of vaccines and so forth. All of those have a part to play. So we think about it as survival science rather than conservation science, because it embraces all of these other aspects of social science, of medical science, veterinary science, and of course classic conservation and ecological science.
So under this huge umbrella of survival science, it's actually a vast and arrayed form of different scientific practices working together.
Absolutely, and there's so many different aspects to take into account there. So there's a role for everyone. So I would hope out there's a whole bunch of budding young scientists who want to be a geneticist and work on the koala genome, which was recently completely sequenced, who are actually really interested in social science and want to understand how people connect with nature, who are really interested in field-based conservation science, who may be botanists, because you can't have koalas without plants. So much of this is about how you plant and conserve the trees that they need and in the condition that is suitable for them. So many different branches of science come together to support animals like koalas. And koalas then become the exemplar, the flag animal, if you like, the flag bearer for a whole array of other species that haven't attracted enough interest. And also ecosystems too, because much of this is about how you preserve ecosystems, including those with people on them.
You just mentioned right then about how studying koalas in this way can bring to light some of the other species that are less known. Why are koalas so in the light?
Yeah, they have just been an animal that people immediately appeal to. And this has been used across a wide range of different scenarios. A lot of the conservation organisations use koalas as their emblem. So you've seen here a couple of photos where we have a koala that's been in a flood situation. That went viral and millions of people saw that. Koalas, of course, in the bushfires on Kangaroo Island and through New South Wales and Queensland became the emblem there for the disasters of the fires and also the effect of climate change on the planet.
Right.
Because look at it, it's looking at you going, help me.
It tugs at your heartstrings.
It absolutely does. It's an incredibly emotional picture.
And we've also seen the koalas looking very cute as well, so it's so easy to compare those two things.
And in fact, that cuteness is really important for us. So the picture there of the soldiers, those were some of the detail that served on Kangaroo Island in the recovery of after the fires, and they found it very traumatic. A huge number of animals died in the fires on Kangaroo Island, thousands upon thousands, and dealing with the death of wildlife plus the death of stock and livestock, the loss of property for people, was very tough on many of the soldiers who were working there. When we rescued koalas that have disease-free, so don't have corvial chlamydia, and these animals came to Cleveland, but we rescued joeys who had lost their mums and had no chance of survival, they needed to be fed. And the soldiers actually fed these animals for 6 weeks, 3 times a day, and they loved it because it was a relax, it was a way to unwind, it was a way to find something good out of an incredible disaster. And so it was amazing. We had soldiers, sailors, airmen, we had the New Zealand contingent came. There was even an interest from the Canadian firefighters. I'm not sure if they came there. And they would come, hold the koalas for a while and feed them. Magic.
And it's not just an emblem of other animals as well. It's not just the koala that's tugging at your heartstrings. It brings to light the whole science behind changing climate and the things that we need to do towards that. And it's really great to see in some of these situations other people trying to get involved. But it's still such an amazing thing to me that the whole world looks at this and feels something. So when we're looking at our international relationships, do koalas act as ambassadors?
Yes, they can. Because they're such a strongly emotional animal, probably because they're forward-facing eyes and the way they look and they feel that you get from them. They have been used in all sorts of branding. You think of all sorts of odd things have koalas. There's a koala Pizza Hut makers, and koalas are used everywhere. They've been used in tourist campaigns here. I love the one here with holding a panda, which is one of the other two most loved animals, and it's used as an example of connecting China and Australia together. It brings out very strong emotions. And obviously famous people love to hold a koala, like Ronnie Wood's there. And whenever you have a visiting politician, they've got to hold a koala. And in fact, it's become almost a bit passé, really, isn't it, that politicians hug koalas at every opportunity. One politician very famously said in about, I think it was 1990, was very critical of koalas and complained that they bite you and might pee on you and so forth, and was almost hounded out of office. His career disappeared for daring to comment negatively about koalas.
So why is that?
Well, I think that people love them so much, and they're such an important ambassador, and they're an outward face to the rest of the world. They're Australia, who we are, who we want to be. We have these wonderful animals. We're not full of snakes and spiders. We've got this animal as well. So if you start criticising it, you do damage the brand somewhat.
So we've got a certain pride in our Australian koalas. What about if we send them overseas? What about at zoos and other places in the world? So
we don't send koalas overseas very often. There was some significant shipments of northern koalas to China and to the US, to Japan, and to a couple of other smaller locations in the 90s. Now koalas are classified as ambassador animals. And in fact, southern koalas have only been shipped to the United Kingdom and to Hong Kong. They can only go to places that are approved by the federal government and that have to be really substantial parks with a commitment to conservation. So they have to start with have very large plantations of gum trees.
Yes.
Because they are very difficult. They have to be able to look after them, to deal with their fussiness, to breed them, and be strongly connected to conservation organisations back here in Australia. So the International Koala Centre for Excellence has a strong relationship with Longleat, where they raise money and support the research here and the conservation messages here. So that's a really important part about engaging the zoological communities in conservation here in Australia. But we do it very infrequently.
Right. So it's not like the case with the rhinos coming here. They're not going to get the same environment.
No, they can have a similar sort of climatic environment, but you have to have their trees established, and you have to build very special enclosures for them, which is why they only go to places that are, top of the international tree in terms of zoological places. But it happens very infrequently. We get a lot of requests for it, but very, very few even start the process. And it takes years to go through the whole process if animals are to be exported. So we've got to understand the reasons why we would do it. It must be done for conservation purposes.
Right. And so if we're looking at them not necessarily even being overseas, but knowing how deeply people associate koalas with Australia and the Australian culture with koalas, do you think they have any impact on us and how we see our own culture?
I think they do. I think they actually do extraordinarily, and we really saw that with the bushfires, where koalas became the emblem. But the international attention brought to Australia from these bushfires was so much greater because koalas were affected, and it was really part of the imagery here. So the bushfires were spectacular. Some 2% of a continent burnt in January, and it's absolute, and every state was affected. But it was the koala and the struggling of the koala and the images of people rescuing koalas and the burnt koalas and the enormous tragedy of that mobilised the world to donate huge amounts of money to all sorts of different rescue and conservation organisations across the whole country, really, to start this program of rehabilitating land, replanting trees, rewilding the koalas, protecting them. There are sanctuaries at Taronga Zoo, there's one at Clearland. All these are really important aspects, and they're supported by the world. And that did make us go, actually, these are really important, and maybe forests are really important. And yes, we know the Amazon's burning and California's burning, and forests around the world were being lost. But we're losing our forests too. So shouldn't we be doing something about that? Shouldn't we be thinking about how important they are because they have the koala, but actually for a whole range of other reasons too? It's important to have forests for climate change. It's important for clean air, to have the oxygen that we need. Forests are incredibly important for our physical and mental health. And COVID-19 has shown us how important a walk in a forest is when you're feeling really down about all that's going on around us. So we now really appreciate the vital part that nature plays in our lives. And that hasn't been really clear till literally the last year.
Yeah.
And koalas have led that.
It feels like a case of nature leading nature in a way, trying to remind us of our effect on it and what we need to do for that. And what an animal to show us that.
That's right. It really has encapsulated all of these issues that have otherwise been seen as esoteric or not real and not really impacting on us. The koalas really showed us that these issues are our issues. And our future is in fact linked to koalas and other animals and their chance of survival, and other ecosystems and plants as well, of course.
So what is the future of koalas? What can they expect in the coming decades?
I think they can expect continued challenges. Their habitat is in areas where we live, so there's always going to be pressure to grow urban communities, increase agricultural land. But there's growing understanding that we have to preserve them. We have to preserve them for their sake, but we have to preserve them for our sake, for our economic sake, for the social structure of our communities, for the way we are as people, for our sense of place. So, like the drop bear stories, we love the drop bear stories because it makes us feel good about ourselves and a little bit better than everyone else. If we were to lose koalas, then we would be losing a big part of ourselves.
Yes.
So I think we will see people really mobilising into supporting those who have a whole array of activities around koalas. The koala rescue people, the amateur groups, the scientists, the zoological communities all play really important roles in preserving koalas and preserving their habitat, and then by extension a whole array of other species that might be even more imperiled than koalas.
And how do we mobilise if we're not scientists? What kind of things can we do?
So one, be involved, be interested, follow the science, read the information that's put out by the scientists. Follow the conservation organisations as well. Many of those have strong programs around the rehabilitation of land, planting of trees and so forth. And get involved in citizen science projects. There's a wide range of citizen science projects across their whole area, the Great Koala Count being one that we started here in South Australia, where the only way you can count koalas is to get lots of volunteers out there to count them. And it's similarly practiced in New South Wales and Queensland as well. But there's a range of other citizen science projects that everybody can participate in. So go to the citizen science organisations, and there's a fantastic one here in South Australia, and see what they have on offer.
And how do we make sure that we're finding the correct information?
It's always a real challenge, and like anything on the web, there's all sorts of rubbish and then there's fantastic stuff. So look to make sure that the organisation is a bona fide. So it's a university, it's a government department where there are very strict rules and regulations about information that's published. If it looks dodgy, see if you can find another source that collaborates it. If you can't, it's probably a bit rough. Is the individual who's posting that material suitably qualified? Are they backed up by others? And what's the general consensus? So you can, in the same way that you have to decide about a lot of things on the web, you can take that same approach. And that's actually a really important skill for everyone to learn, is to how to find the good science from the all sorts of mischief and witchcraft that's out there.
And you don't need a degree to be able to do that.
No, you need to be critical.
Yes.
You need to be skeptic. You need to be very... Skeptic is actually a good word. It's not one that always rejects. You're actually thinking through this, and is this right? And you should always ask questions. The fundamental part of science is to ask questions. The scientific method is how you ask a question. If asking questions is really important, see who's doing it, go talk to them. Plenty of places now have online forums, have blogs, have ways to connect and ask questions.
Well, in that case, can I ask you a question that might be a bit silly? If the koalas only eat 4 types of eucalyptus, but eucalyptus kind of smells good, what about koala poos?
That's such an insightful question, because what goes in must come out. So koalas are there chewing away on their food for about anywhere up to 5 or 6 hours a day, and then they sleep the other 15 or so, or 18 hours a day.
That's another myth that I've heard. People told me they sleep for 22 hours a day.
Yeah, it's a little long. I mean, they've got to eat as well. But it's about 15 to 18 hours a day.
Right.
And then they'll feed for about 5, and then they wander around and do the things that koalas do with the remaining time there. But eating all of this stuff rich in eucalypt means that it has to come out, and they produce huge amounts of poo, or fecal pellets as we call them, which doesn't sound anywhere near as much fun as poo, but I prefer that. And that actually smells of eucalypt. So koalas actually have the most beautiful smelling poo of any animal.
Does that benefit them in any way, or
no, it's a characteristic. The eucalypt smell also comes out in their fur. So when you hold one, it smells like eucalyptus.
Wow.
You have this incredible aroma of this beautiful eucalyptus odor. It's like a giant menthol lolly that's fuzzy.
That's amazing. Now, if a koala were to come to my house, like we saw someone had the picture of the koala coming into the toilet, can I hold it?
No, it's not a good idea, because remember, they're a large wild animal, and just because something's really pretty doesn't mean it can't be dangerous. So koalas have very large claws because they climb trees. So they hold on and they have very strong grip. They can bite and they have sharp teeth. So, and they're big. You know, a big male can be 15 kilos. It can be, you know, that big. So it can be a substantial animal that is wild. If it's trapped in your house, it can be scared, and that can make it unpredictable, like any wild animal. So usually if you wind up one, call fauna rescue or call the appropriate authorities, and they will be able to handle it for you. They're trained to do it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Now, you spoke a little bit about how the koala genome had just recently been sequenced not very long ago. Has there been anything about koalas that you've learnt recently that has just flabbergasted you?
Gosh, I think we are learning so much about them. I think their evolutionary origins is of incredible interest, and the idea that there were so many different types and now there is one. I think so many aspects of their biology is really interesting. The way they interact with each other, which is noisy and boisterous and pretty full on. I think one of the areas of great interest to me personally is the way people interact with them, and that they want to see a koala, and why is that, and then how we use that. And there's a really growing branch of social science that reflects how we can work with people's attitudes to koalas to improve our attitude to conservation. But they continue to do amazing things. So I learned just recently, and I was watching one, found that all koalas, when they come down a tree, always come down backwards. And I actually thought they occasionally would come down other different ways, like you see a leopard running down a tree and jumping.
They're coming bottom first?
Yes, always bottom first. It's not like a leopard coming down head first and then running off. Nope, they hang onto the tree and they waddle down bum first each time.
What if they're getting from one tree to another tree?
So when they come down bottom first and they go up head first.
Can they jump from one tree to another?
Yes, yeah, they're actually incredibly good jumpers. So koalas can leap about 2 to 3 metres. So they're actually quite difficult to keep in an enclosure. People think that they're sloths because they sleep during the day, but they can be incredibly active at night. And look, if a boy koala wants to meet a girl koala and they're 2 metres apart, he'll jump.
How far can they jump?
So 2 to 3 metres.
I can't even fathom that. They're so small.
Much further
it's
than
amazing.
from me to you. Yeah, they'll hurl themselves. Up at Cleveland, we had one young koala we called Leaping Leo. He loved to jump. He was always jumping from one tree and one bough to another.
Wow.
I mean, it's an amazing thing. You think they'd be nice and quiet all the time, but it's not true. And they can run quite fast too, and they can swim.
They're not quiet. I remember the first time I heard a male koala, and I actually thought it was a dirt bike. And I was like, get off the track, a dirt bike's coming. And someone had to be like, it's just a koala.
Another amazing thing that they do is that they're really good vocalizers.
Yeah.
So the bulls, the big males, have this deep bellow where they announce them that I'm here, I'm the big one. If you want any of the ladies, bring it on. and it's deep because it will carry such a long distance. The females have a much wider range of sounds. They will squeak and holler. If they don't like the boy, they will carry on with a whole a mass of different loud sounds that is also just really weird. But the big bellowing of the big bulls is an incredibly eerie sound of the Australian bush. And when you hear it for the first time, you just go, wow, what's making that noise?
I think absolutely wow. And I have so many questions for already, even though I felt like I asked 100, I still have more, but I've monopolized you enough tonight. So we're going to open it up to some audience questions. So if you have any questions, we'll be able to ask Chris right now.
Okay, our first question comes in and asks, could the northern koala survive in southern Australia and vice versa? And would this change with climate change?
The first part is yes, absolutely. And in fact, there are historical records of northern koalas living in the Mount Lofties. Some people had apparently collected them and brought them out. Some of the pubs in the hills used to have northern koalas on display. And the koala zoo that was set up just outside the Women's and Children's Hospital was all northern koalas, and that closed in about 1960, I think. So yes, they can and do and have lived here, and they live in a range of different climates around the world and do very effectively.
So based on the morphological differences that you said before, the northern and the southern koalas, do they have advantages beyond one being fluffier, maybe more suited to the cold, that would change if you moved them to a different climate?
It doesn't appear so. So again, they're very, very closely related. So why one is a bit smaller than another might also be a product of being isolated.
Right.
It's just they're in a different part of their range and they've been slightly different. There's the idea of being a different climate thing is possible, but hasn't been demonstrated accurately enough.
Interesting.
However, if climate change, or as climate change occurs, it's likely to affect the type of plants. So it'll affect the distribution of the eucalypts and the nature of the habitat. That can be very profound because they're such specialists.
Right.
So if we find that manigums are not as common as they used to be in one particular area, then that will severely affect the koalas. And koalas used to be in the Mount Lofties. They probably disappeared here about 10,000 years ago, and that may well have been as a result of climate change, changing the plant assemblage, so therefore not making the habitat as good for the koalas as it was.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, let's try another question then.
We've had another question just asking if you could elaborate a little further about tannin in gum leaves.
So tannin is a chemical that is found in gum leaves of all of species, and it's actually produced as a defence. Plants produce a lot of chemical defences to stop them being eaten by caterpillars and of course being browsed by other animals. So these tannins are produced and they can be really toxic for many species. So koalas and also ringtail possums and greater gliders actually have bacteria in their gut that can break down the eucalypt and immobilise the tannins, if you like, so they are not toxic. And that's how the koalas can survive. There is an urban myth that the tannins make the koalas sleepy and they're drugged all day, which is why they sleep. But that's not true. They are largely immune to the tannins.
Wow. Yeah, let's go with another question.
So we've had a couple of questions around this subject. It says, has it been recorded that northern and southern koalas interbreed?
Yes, they can interbreed, and this has happened in the past, and they interbreed quite successfully. They're called northern and southern because they're just different parts of their range. We sometimes think about the koalas in terms of three subspecies: the Queensland subspecies, the New South Wales subspecies, and the Victorian ones. But really that's a geographic separation. Genetically they're very, very similar, so they're very capable of interbreeding. And in there lies a possible solution too, as we can develop cures for some of the genetic diseases, there's a possibility to interbreed and move around some parts of the genome so you can give protection to some diseases in different communities. But yeah, there's no problem at all about interbreeding.
Wow.
We have another question, and it is, when is the Great Koala Count this year?
Yes, there's not one on this year, but we're just starting to think about whether we should have a Great Koala Count 3. So we had one in 2012, one in 2016, and I think we're due to have one in the next couple of years. So it's about starting to develop. I think there's ones going on in Queensland and New South Wales, and you'd have to check the Department for Environment websites there to find out if and when that's happening. Usually, if it happens in springtime. That's when there's the most activity in koalas.
So we've got a couple more questions that had come to me beforehand that I was given preemptively, if that's okay. One of them was, what's the difference between managing populations and conservation in terms of when you have the overabundance of koalas?
Yeah, so managing populations is a really challenging thing for any community, for scientists and for people who are deeply engaged in koalas in an amateur and professional way to come to grips with. So if you have a population that is overabundant, so that it's overeating, it's overusing its resources, there are a number of ways to manage it. The one that's most commonly spoken about is culling. Culling, in most cases, isn't effective because you're often killing indiscriminately. So you wind up killing males. Well, that doesn't affect the population growth of the animal. Or you're killing older females. So that doesn't work. It's incredibly distressing for all concerned. You can have loss of joeys. It's all a mess. And in some cases, it can actually be counterproductive because you reduce the number of animals in a spot. The trees all recover, they have lots of green shoots, or the grasses recover if it's done with kangaroos or whatever, and then even more come in. So you wind up with even more than you had previously, where the limit of food kept the numbers down. So you have to be very careful if you're culling about where you're doing it, why you're doing it, and what you're doing it for. So culling is illegal in South Australia. It's absolutely off the agenda. There are other ways. Translocation of animals, moving them to other locations, can be very effective. So can sterilisation, so making females permanently infertile. Or there is contraception, which means making them temporarily infertile over a short period. All of these options can be trialled, but you have to get a management plan. You have to know exactly how many is the right number, what's going to change over time, what happens to the population structure. If you suddenly take out lots of females, you might reduce the population and then it might crash later on. What is the effect of disease? What's the effect on other animals? So you can lead to overabundance of other species if you reduce one. So you've really got to understand the ecology of an animal before you start any of those sorts of management plans. The other thing is you have to involve the community. Community have very, very strong views, often yes or no, around the management of overabundant species. They're often very clear if they don't like an animal. So if you're managing foxes, for example, then it's usually fairly clear. Once you come to manage an animal that you particularly like a koala, like kangaroos, possums are much loved by some segments of the community, you have a whole divergent set of views, and you need to have people reconcile to that management plan and be part of it. So engaging and working with community is a really important part of any management plan, especially if it's in people's backyards.
Yes, absolutely. We have such a strong connection when it's right there.
That's right.
Now, another question I had been given beforehand was whether we have a national koala rescue program or management program, and whether that would be different from a local program.
So we do desperately need a national strategy. Not necessarily a rescue one, because it depends again on why you're rescuing them and what you're rescuing for and where you're taking them to. So it's important to identify areas where they are underabundant or declining, and why are they doing it? If you remove them, will that help the problem or hinder the problem? Or if you're adding animals to that area, are you just adding animals that then subsequently die? So you really do need to understand it. So the strategy then needs to look at animals such as koalas and many other species, greater gliders, some of the kangaroo species that are very mobile. Many species need to be looked at to cross borders,
right.
And to use the expertise across the whole country to understand the animal across its entire range. So a national strategy is going to be a really important move. We're not there yet. We tend to view each population on a state-by-state basis, and each state has kind of gone their own way to do their own thing about their koalas, and often the language is about my, and I'm looking after my koalas, not our koalas. And that creates some challenges, especially if you have very different situations in different areas.
Great, and that leads on to another question. I will ask one more and then we've got another audience question. This leads on to another question that I was given beforehand in terms of local populations. If you were to keep them in those small populations, do they ever succumb to like inbreeding defects?
Yeah, they can definitely inbreed. And in fact, that's what happened to the koalas introduced to Kangaroo Island. So when there was this extensive extermination and hunting of koalas in the 19th century, small populations from the Otways were moved to French Island, and then only 18 were taken from there to release into Kangaroo Island, which was to be an ark, a protective zone. And platypus were introduced there for the same reason. But that was a very few, and they had some interesting little characteristics. Oxalate nephrosis being one, the renal disease we talked about. Sometimes they have what's called testicular aplasia, and a range of other little issues that they can have. And then from there, only a few, probably as little as 6, were taken to Mount Lofty Ranges.
Wow.
And now we have hundreds of thousands of them, over 100,000 koalas in the Mount Lofties. So each of those have those characteristics. So they are seriously inbred, but just because they're inbred doesn't mean they're not fecund, which means they're not capable of very high levels of reproduction.
Wow.
And in fact, we have grown up a lot of species from a very small number of individuals and been able to recover them, and they can go on fine. So lack of genetic variability isn't always a problem. It can make them more susceptible to infections. There's less variation, so if a population crashes, you haven't got those handful of superheroes who are a little bit different who can survive it. That's the risk with them, but it doesn't mean that they're not valuable and they're not able to bring back a whole population.
Yeah, that's a big change. That's a huge increase. So,
oh, look, 18 to 50,000 on Kangaroo Island is pretty spectacular in about 80 years.
Yeah.
And similarly, the rapid growth in the Mount Lofties is spectacular.
Fantastic.
Why that is, we don't know.
Fantastic. We'll have our audience question again now.
So the question is, when cared for in captivity and then released, does this affect their morbidity later?
It depends on where they've been in captivity and how they've been raised and so forth. It can. So if you have carers or zoological parks who've had a very small joey that has been separated and isolated, and then they've cared for it for a long period of time, it can become very connected to people, and that would make it difficult to release. On the other hand, if they have been found wandering on a road, if they have been hurt, and they're brought to a rescue, kept for 6-8 weeks, and then there's no problem with releasing them. So it depends on the animal, its size, age, health, and then also where it's released. But because koalas are sanguine animals in many ways, and they're happy to climb a tree as long as it's the right tree with the right food, they do quickly adapt back into the wild.
That's really, really good to hear. Now, we are running out of time, so one quick question before we go. Have you had, what would you say was one of your best experiences with a koala?
Oh, look, there have been so many, but I think my favourite one was up at Cleveland Wildlife Park, and we had a really experienced koala keeper who was up there who had hand-raised a number of youngsters. One koala in particular was called Isaac. And the koala keeper went away on maternity leave, and Isaac had been she'd grown him up from tiny little baby to about 4 or 5 years old. She went away on maternity leave and was away for 9 months, and then came back and brought her young son to visit the koalas. And she came down to see the koalas in the enclosure, and Isaac was there. And I was talking to Mel, and Isaac heard her voice from a distance of about 50 to 60 metres. And he perked up and sat up and looked. Then he climbed down on his perch and he walked all along the enclosure right up to where he saw Mel coming, then waited for her and then went like this to pick up. So he recognised at great distance Mel and really responded with her. Mel was in tears, it was just an incredibly emotional experience. So they have incredible memories and really strong connections.
That is really adorable and like a really nice thing to finish on. Thank you so much for talking to me tonight. I can guarantee that I have learnt a lot and the audience has surely learnt just as much as me. If you could be absolute delights, please, we are going to be popping our survey monkey into the chat for you to have a look at. Fill that out and let us know any of your thoughts about what went on tonight. And if you want more science content, because honestly, science is great. If you want more science content, just have a look at inspiringsa.org.au for more events that will happen during Science Week, but also more events that will be happening throughout the year. So thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Deb. Had great fun.
And have a very sciencey week.